So let me take the next 60 seconds to tell you what we're going to do in the next 45 to 50 minutes. I'm joined by, as Caroline said, several of my colleagues from the DC office who are each going to provide 5-minute overviews of the provisions in the American Rescue Plan addressing the issues listed on this slide. We will leave the remaining part of the time to address your questions. Feel free throughout the presentation to put any questions in the chat. And my colleague Susan, Frederick, and I will closely monitor, and time permitting, after we address any questions in the chat, we'll ask anyone who may not have put it in the chat to, raise their hand, and we'll unmute your line and you can ask your questions. While our presentation doesn't obviously address every issue in the legislation, we are joined by several other issue specialists from the DC office, so we are happy to try and address your questions in other areas as well. Next slide, Michael. So let's dive right in. The American Rescue Plan is the 6th response or recovery package enacted by Congress and weighs in at $1.9 trillion. It's comprehensive like the CARES Act in that it provides checks to individuals, expanded unemployment benefits, funding for vaccine-related activities, schools, childcare, nutrition, housing, and a host of other areas, and direct aid for state and local governments. This slide gives you a quick snapshot of the size and magnitude of each individual package and the federal COVID-19 relief total across all the packages to date. One of the provisions I mentioned that we want to discuss today, while I'm sure it comes as no surprise, is the $350 billion in aid to state and local governments. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Erlinda, to discuss this in further detail. Erlinda and Michael, would you advance the slides, please?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Molly. My name is Erlinda Doherty. I'm the director of the Budgets and Revenue Committee in our DC office. So thank you so much for attending today. As Molly mentioned, this is the last in, I guess, 6 rounds or 5 rounds, depending upon how you look at it, rounds of funding that have gone to the states to help our citizens, our states, our counties, local governments to mitigate the effects of the virus, and very substantial in that it is as big or equivalent, or maybe even a little more, depending upon who you asked, economists-wise, as the CARES Act. So $350 billion have been allotted to help states, cities, counties, tribal governments, localities to replenish lost revenue and mitigate economic harm from the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, that's different in intent with respect to the CARES Act funds, $150 billion that went to the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which were more specifically targeted to COVID-19 related expenses. State and local governments have until the end of this year, the end of 2024, December 31st, to use the funds. And again, as I mentioned, it can be used, which is different than the previous package or previous CRF funds, to replenish lost revenues due to the shutdown of the economy. And we are working directly with Treasury, and literally as we speak, to clarify regulatory guidance on this state and local funding, as many of our states have had questions, concerns regarding the usability of the funds, as well as some other areas. But we are working very closely, in fact, daily with them to get clarification on those issues. So that's one thing that we're very focused on right now. We were focused on obviously advocating for the funds, and now we are representing the concerns of states as the funds are being implemented. Next slide. As you can see here, the breakdown of the funds, $195 billion go to states and the District of Columbia, which is treated as a state in this package. $25.5 billion is allotted to the states, with each state getting a minimum of $500 million. And the rest of the funds would be allocated based on the state's share of unemployment over a 3-month period from October to December 2020. $132 billion is allotted to local governments, and you can see the breakdown there. And one of the issues, or one of the concerns from the previous CARES Act was that local governments did not get enough to mitigate the effects of the virus. There's been some targeted money here to address some of those concerns. 4.5 billion are going to the U.S. territories, 20 billion to tribal governments, and then an extra 10 billion for a coronavirus capital projects fund. Next slide. And here is again, the allowable uses of funds that we are currently working with Treasury to clarify and get more clear guidance on this. The emergency and economic effects of the pandemic, including aid to households, small businesses, nonprofits, and industries that were left out of earlier relief, such as tourism and hospitality. Premium pay to essential employees or grants to their employers. Government services affected by the revenue reduction resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. Investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. Some I guess, specific or outright mentions of prohibited use of funds are that they can't be used for pensions or to offset revenue reductions resulting from tax cuts, whether they be direct or indirect. And the transfer of funds to private and nonprofit groups, public benefit corporations, and special purpose units of state and local governments, such as water and sewer authorities or airports. Next slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John Juckery, so he can talk about unemployment insurance and labor and housing provisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Erlinda. Good day, everyone. I'll segue right into some of the labor and housing provisions that were included in the rescue plan as well. So first off, the pandemic unemployment insurance provisions were pretty much all extended until September 6th of 2021. And this includes the $300 per week enhanced payment through the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation Program, or commonly referred to as the FPUC, along with pandemic unemployment emergency compensation and the pandemic unemployment assistance, or what has commonly been referred to as PUA or PUA. This is for the gig workers and independent contractors. And the plan also continues to fully fund the financing of state extended benefits for those who exhaust their weeks of regular unemployment benefits due to the continued period of high unemployment, and full federal funding of states that have short-time compensation programs established, STC or work share programs is what they're commonly referred to, is maintained again through the September 6th date. I believe 26 or 27 states have established and maintained a work share program at this point through the pandemic. And another important change is for those who received UI payments last year, especially when it comes to filing their taxes. For this year, there is a provision that now makes the first $10,200 of unemployment payments that were received in 2020 tax-free, non-taxable essentially for those households with income thresholds under $150,000. Moving on to the next slide, I want to mention that the package extends state staffing flexibility for UI workforce agencies, and it includes $2 billion in administrative funding to the Department of Labor. That will then be distributed to the states to detect and prevent fraud and help ensure timely payment of unemployment benefits pursues. And I'd also just like to take a minute to discuss state unemployment trust funds a bit more here. Fortunately, the rescue package does include another extension of interest-free federal UI trust fund loans, again through the September 6th date. However, there is some concern and uncertainty around UI trust funds moving forward with this latest package. As you may be aware, and I think it was kind of alluded to already with Treasury, we do still need confirmation that these funds can be transferred to state UI trust funds in the same way that CARES had provided. We were led to believe that that would be the case, but until we have official guidance from Treasury, I'm not comfortable saying so. I think it's just important to keep in mind at the present time, there are at least 20 states that have taken out federal loans for their UI trust funds, and this has been totaled to states being over $50 billion in debt to the federal government for their trust fund loans thus far. We also know at least 24 states have utilized previous allotted COVID dollars for their trust funds, which amounts to somewhere over $7 billion, also being injected into these, again, state trust funds. There's also 7 states, I should mention, that have taken out both a UI trust fund loan already, and they've also utilized COVID relief funds to boost up their trust funds. So this is clearly a big issue moving forward right now. And as I mentioned, the interest is waived until September 6th of this year, unless they are further extended again by Congress further. Switching gears here a bit, I want to mention the emergency paid leave provisions in this bill, and highlight that the rescue plan now makes states and local governments in the public sector eligible for the reimbursable tax credit for paid leave in the same way that private sector employers were made eligible last year under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Due to the budget reconciliation rules, the reimbursable tax credit on the public sector side for state and locals is not retroactive prior to FFCRA becoming law, and the effective date will be April 1 through September 30th of this year. I still consider this a big win for states, and it will no longer be an unfunded federal mandate on the state and local governments to provide this paid leave for reasons related to COVID. The bill also extends tax credits for employer-provided paid sick leave and family leave established, again, under FFCRA. That's through the same September 30th, 2021 date. There should also be a link in the chat box, or I can put it in there in a minute, to provide a bit more information from the IRS's website. We're still expecting some further guidance around there, but this is what we have so far. And then moving on to the final slide here, I just want to close out with the rescue plan's key housing and homelessness provisions that pretty much build upon, again, the previously enacted federal aid measures from last year. The bill appropriates over $27 billion in emergency rental assistance. And broken down further, you can see the allocations from this funding. It's our understanding that these emergency rental assistance dollars will remain available through September 30th of 2027, as long as those funds are obligated by October 1st of next year of 2022. The $5 billion for emergency housing vouchers will remain available until September 30th of 2030 as well. Other funding mechanisms outside of Treasury and HUD come from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically USDA's Section 502 and 504 direct loan programs. The programs collectively receive $39 million to assist rural homeowners. And one thing to note about this funding is that no more than 15% of it can be used to pay state and local government administrative costs. And with that, I am more than happy to yield here and hand it over to my colleague, Haley Nicholson. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to go through a few different topics, and I do have to hop off a little early. So if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat and I can follow up with you after as well. So this is an overview of some of the health funding that was included in the bill, including for funding things like vaccine activities, building up public health infrastructure, bolstering current state programs, funding for Indian Health Service, health workforce, and community health centers. So kind of touching on, Molly and Yolanda mentioned the previous packages, kind of funding being allocated to some of those same things that we had seen in the past few relief bills. So we could go to the next slide, please. This is the human services funding side. Again, seeing some similarities from previous bills, including additional funds, but in the areas of childcare and development block grant, some newly created childcare stabilization grants, maternal and early childhood home visiting program, behavioral health clinics, and Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. So quite a few programs that some we have seen funding, some was newly created funding. I know there's a lot of numbers being shared. So if people have additional questions or curious what have states received and states are projected to receive, we can also share that as well. Michael, if you go to the next slide, this is where I want to talk about some of the policy provisions that were included. Things in terms of Medicaid having full coverage for COVID-19 vaccines and treatment for Medicaid enrollees and children that are enrolled under the Children's Health Insurance Program. On the Medicare side, a couple of provisions regarding providers, including looking at disproportionate share hospitals and funds for them, accounting for, if looking at that funding has to also account for the increased FMAP that was given to states, at 6.2% from the first relief bill, and HHS will have to verify when checking different dish payments. Childcare, again, increased or additional amounts for block grants to states, other supports on that. And my colleague Margaret Weil is on as well. So if you have specifics around the childcare piece, early childhood, I know she can help with that as well. Under Medicaid, there was also a couple other provisions, including increased FMAP for states that choose to expand Medicaid for up to 2 years. It's a temporary extension if they choose that. Also an 85% FMAP increase for 3 years for states if they want to, for covering mobile crisis services, including behavioral health and substance use disorder. And allowing states, again, all of this is optional. States would like to do this. A 5-year option to cover postpartum coverage for women enrolled in Medicaid, and that's for up to 5 years. And then the other provision, which we've got quite a few questions on, is home and community-based services. Now, this just also allows states to apply for increased FMAP. That increase is not just for the base of home and community-based services, it's in addition to. But this funding, it only lasts for 1 year compared to the others are several years, and states can start applying next month. We have reached out to CMS specifically on some of these FMAP increases and for states when applying, especially in this home and community-based services. What would this look like if it is in addition to their base funding? And some of those more technical questions, we're still waiting to hear back from CMS on some of the guidance that will hopefully be coming out soon, especially for those where the time frame to get the increased FMAP is shorter. And then health insurance, quite a few different provisions for covering folks that are individuals that are interested in enrolling in the marketplace. So essentially what the big guidance is now is if you, or if someone would like to enroll in a plan and they need coverage, if an individual needs coverage starting April 1st, enroll now and then go back to see what other additional subsidies that you would qualify for premium coverage. And so the premium coverage, it's using what they're looking at is a silver plan in the marketplace, this kind of average plan. What would this compare to? And then the individual that's enrolling can see, based upon different tax information, household tax information, they can see where they qualify. That doesn't mean they have to enroll in that silver plan, but it just gives them a point of reference, and then they can enroll in whichever plan they like. And they may get, depending on the level of plan and the cost and the coverage, they'll definitely have savings, but how much they will save will depend on the plan they pick. We also just got some guidance today that I will put in the chat on special enrollment period, which has been extended, but also a piece that was included in this bill was for those who at any point have received unemployment compensation, that they can also use that for a premium saving in the marketplace. And they're now saying that early July, people can determine if they did get unemployment compensation, they can go back in and see what they may qualify for in addition to their household income situation. So that's early July. Other premium savings, people can enroll now, and then starting on April 1st, go back in to see. It's still being discussed as well if that maybe people could also determine their premium savings based on tax information from 2021. So a lot of big different kind of shifts in some of the coverage pieces, and happy to share additional information. As we know, individuals that are enrolling, there's just kind of a lot of different moving parts, but it seems now that things are getting a little bit more solid about when should you apply, and if you qualify under different situations, what would that look like for an individual? Michael, can you go to the next slide, please? And that is all I have for Health and Human Services. I will turn it over to my colleague, Austin Reed. And like I said, I have to jump off a little early, but please feel free to reach out if you have additional questions and I wasn't able to be on for them. And thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks, Haley, and hi, everyone. My name is Austin Reed. I handle federal education here for NCSL. Let's talk education funding. So most of the funding through the ARPA goes directly through the existing Education Stabilization Fund, which is the same funding structure that's been used in the previous two stimulus packages. This time around, there's a significant amount of funding. Overall, there's 128 total, 228 billion in total funding for K-12 education. About 110 billion of that goes directly to school districts. And that also includes another $3 billion for the Individuals with Disabilities Act in annual appropriations. So there's for that for K-12, and then there's also an additional $40 billion for higher education. Just to go through the funding mechanisms, same as before for K-12, these funds are distributed to states based on their share of Title I funding and then off to districts by that same proportion. And then in the higher ed side, the funds are distributed to just about every college and university, just based on primarily how many low-income students they serve. Also, a couple interesting programs. There's about $800 million to support homeless and foster youth. There's also $7.2 billion through the E-rate program, which will help libraries and schools provide internet connectivity and services to students. They're also talking about adding some flexibility into that program to meet students in the home. I think previously the program was set up to mostly go through the school building itself. But we know that that's not necessarily the best option for every student during the pandemic. So those flexibilities are being explored by the FCC right now. And there's also another $5 billion to extend the pandemic EBT program, which allows parents who have students that qualify for free and reduced price lunch to receive an additional benefit to compensate for maybe the lack of access to school meals. I do want to put this funding into context because it's a significant amount. The total money for K-12 is about 5 to 6 times the annual federal spending rate on K-12 education alone. And I think this is basically considered the highest investment that the federal government has ever made in K-12 education at one time. So there's a lot of discussions about how to use these funds, and we'll kind of get into that to a second. So I want to first start with how the higher ed funds are supposed to be used. So every university just about is going to get some level of funding. Once the university receives those funds, 50% of the funds have to be spent on emergency aid to students. And the universities are, as they have before, asked to create the distribution process for those funds and determine who qualifies, although they are asked to prioritize students with exceptional need. And then once students receive that emergency aid, they are allowed to use that funding on anything that would be considered a part of a student's cost of attendance, which is pretty considerable. It could be anything from tuition and fees to living expenses to even childcare, getting internet connectivity, things like that. And then the other 50% of funds that the university receives could also be put towards emergency aid for students, but the universities themselves could also use that to compensate for any revenue declines that they are seeing or pay for any sort of unforeseen expenses that relate to the pandemic. So let's go to the next slide and talk about the K-12 funding and what it's going to be used. So there are some differences between this round of K-12 funding and the last round. First, districts do receive 90% of these total funds, but they have to set aside at least 20% for learning loss activities. And then for the state before and as now could reserve up to 10% of their total funds for statewide activities to address the pandemic. This time, that set aside is a little more dictated. Every state has to reserve at least 5% of its funding for activities to address learning loss. Also has to reserve at least 1% for after school programs and 1% of funds for summer school programs. And then there's a remaining 3% of funds that the state can use at its discretion. So there's a real emphasis on reservations to address learning loss. I think the total amount that at least has to be reserved from this pot of funding for learning loss is about $28 billion. I'm sure far more than that's going to be spent on learning loss, but at least $28 billion of this has to be set aside to address that. We are monitoring potential state action, legislative action on these set-asides and how districts use these funds. Obviously, the federal legislation lays out district uses and the state set-asides, but we are seeing some states that have directed the state agency as to how they should go about setting aside their funds and how they should distribute that. So happy to answer any questions on that, but that is something new that we're seeing this time around that we hadn't seen in the past. And that's simply because the Education Stabilization Fund runs through executive agencies. But I think we're seeing some legislatures that have said that the emergency period is over. We want to make sure these funds are going through regular processes. In terms of uses at the district level, these funds are highly flexible. I think essentially anything you can think of that would be related to responding to the pandemic is essentially an allowable use. That can include, in many instances, construction projects, ventilation, HVAC systems, all of that is an enumerated allowable use under these funds. But that use for construction may expand just beyond those particular uses. So one thing that's useful to know is I think the uses are flexible, but we're trying to get a sense of how long districts are going to have these funds and how they should sequence the spending of these funds. It's anticipated that districts will have until about September 2024 to obligate these rounds of funds, but there's some thinking that if they manage their spending right, that they may have these funds through 2025, 2026. So the real question for districts is they have all this influx of funding, and districts need to be careful that they don't put in new programs or uses that may go away once the funding runs out. And so there's a real question about how do you sequence these funds to make sure that any new programs you put in might be sustainable over time, or how to make sure that these funds aren't just being sent to the first program that pops up, but to really high quality programs. So I think that's really going to be the big conversation that the education community is having. Go to the next slide, please. And then I'll just quickly hit on this. There are across the three stimulus packages, there are maintenance of effort provisions that states need to be mindful of. They extend from fiscal year 20 all the way through fiscal year 2023. The first two fiscal years, maintenance of effort basically asks states to maintain the same level of spending as they did before the pandemic. The new maintenance of effort asks that states maintain proportional spending on K-12 and higher education separately as they did before the pandemic. And there's also in this spending bill a new state maintenance of equity provision, which is intended to discourage states from making any disproportional cuts to what the bill defines as high need or highest poverty districts. Most funding formulas don't do that anyway, but one provision that states are going to be mindful of is whether the cuts that they make are, if they make cuts below the 2019 levels, they are not supposed to decrease that funding for the districts that are deemed highest poverty. So I'm happy to answer any questions later. But that's sort of just an overview of the education funds. It's a historic amount, and there's a lot of conversation left to be had about how to spend those. So I believe Troyce is up next, so I'll send it over to him.
Thanks, Austin, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to briefly cover some of the small business provisions that were included in the American Rescue Plan. I'll start off with the Paycheck Protection Program, which I know that everyone is probably very familiar with at this point, so I won't spend too much time on it, but the ARP did include $7.25 billion in additional funding for the PPP. It may seem like that's a small amount compared to past bills, and it is, but there was a large infusion of funding in the bill that was signed into law in December of last year, and there's still money remaining in the program, which I'll touch on a bit later. So that kind of explains the relatively small amount in this package. The American Rescue Plan does expand the type of nonprofits that are eligible for the PPP, including for larger 501c3s and veterans groups with 500 or fewer employees, as well as 501c6s with 300 or fewer employees. Next slide, please. So some of the other programs that received additional funding include the Small Business Administration's EIDL program, which stands for Economic Injury Disaster Loans. While EIDL loans are available, they are not 100% forgivable like Paycheck Protection Program loans are. However, there are what is called an EIDL advance payment that are available to EIDL applicants, and the ARP included $15 billion in additional funding for the advance payment component of the program, which are up to $10,000, and those are 100% forgivable. So businesses in low-income communities are eligible for the advance payments as long as their businesses have no more than 300 employees and have suffered a loss of 30% or more in revenue. There was also $29 billion allocated in the newly created Restaurant Revitalization Fund, which will provide loans to restaurants, bars, food trucks, caterers, breweries and wineries, lounges, basically any place where the public gets together to be served food or drinks are going to be eligible. The Small Business Administration will be administering the program, although the application process itself is still being figured out. We do know that the restaurants cannot have more than 20 locations, and businesses will be eligible for a maximum of up to $10 million per entity or $5 million per location. But that, again, that's the maximum. That's not like a guaranteed amount that everyone would get. The grants will be calculated by subtracting 2020 revenue from 2019 revenue. And additionally, $5 billion of that $29 billion has been set aside specifically for businesses that had gross receipts during 2019 of no more than $500,000. And that's kind of in an effort to target smaller restaurants and make sure that there's funding specifically for them. There's also $15 billion in funds allocated for the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, which will help museums and concert venues, theaters, similar enterprises like that. And the SBA expects to open applications for that program in early April, so potentially by next week. $10 billion was also appropriated to reauthorize the State Small Business Credit Initiative, which was actually created by a law in 2010, and the program expired in 2017. So the initiative will allow state governments to provide capital and make low interest loans to small businesses to help them recover from the pandemic. The funding to each state will be determined by looking at each state's respective employment level decline in 2020. And those funds are also supposed to be dispersed by the Treasury Department within 30 days of the ARP's enactment. So I believe that's somewhere around April 11th or April 14th, somewhere in that span of time. There's still a lot of details to be figured out on how that initiative is going to work with states, but there is $10 billion allocated for that. And the last thing I wanted to mention before I wrap up is that as of 3 days ago, on March 21st, over 8.2 million paycheck protection loans have been made to American businesses with a grand total of over $718 billion over the last year. So that means there's roughly, by my count, roughly $88 billion that is still remaining in Paycheck Protection Program funding. So if there are businesses that are still in need of assistance, they should apply as soon as possible. There's plenty of money, and even if a business received a PPP loan last year, they are eligible for a second loan as well. Congress is working to extend the loan processing deadline, which is currently set at March 31st. The House of Representatives last week passed a bill to extend the deadline by a vote of 415-3. The Senate is expected to pass the bill at some point this week. This bill would would make the new deadline May 31st, as well as give the SBA the ability to continue processing applications for 30 days after that date. So there's still plenty of money left. A second PPP loan is available for those that need it, and the deadline should be pushed back soon. So any business who needs the help should apply as soon as possible. So that was a quick wrap up, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Trace. And that concludes our formal presentation of what is in the American Rescue Plan. We're going to open it up for questions in just a second, but I did want to give you everyone's name. And these are the pictures of all the faces in NCSL and DC. And if you want to follow up afterwards with any of the staff, most of you are familiar knowing NCSL's email structure, but it's first name dot last name at ncsl.org. And with that, I'm going to screen